Welcome to a bizarre episode of Superhuman Radio. I feel like this is the Twilight Zone. We had problems with StreamYard, but I insisted on getting this show done because it's so important. And I'm so lucky to have Dr. Dan Cooper with me today from the University of California at Irvine. And we're going to be talking about GLP receptor agonists for children. It's already been approved by the FDA, but there are obviously some potential risks we're going to discuss. And let's be honest, these drugs are so new. We don't even know what they're doing to adults. Some of the science is starting to unfold now with the gastric paralysis after long-term use. There was a study in rodents with human cells that show that it stimulates breast cancer in rodents with the human cells. I mean, everybody says, "Oh, that's rodents," but they took the time to use human cells. There's a lot of information unfolding about these drugs, but the whole world is on board with them. They can't wait to get them. In fact, these companies can't keep this stuff in stock. Mounjaro, Ozempic, I mean, you name it, they have it. So we're going to talk about what are the potential pitfalls and risks when they're offered to children. And I love the way the literature says for diabetes and obesity, which they typically go hand in hand, and it's really more so for obesity these drugs are being used today than just diabetes. Welcome to the show, Dr. Cooper. How are you?
Very good. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so like I said, this is an odd way to do a show, but we wanted to get this information out there. Why this study? What preceded this that you felt the need to, like, we need to look at this?
Yeah, well, there were two things, Carl. One is my research for the past several decades has been focused on the question of physical activity and exercise in children during growth and development. Particularly, we focused on lower socioeconomic kids where there's environmental factors that prevent them from healthy exercise. But in general, the whole question of the role of physical activity in health. And we've done studies in schools, and we've done studies that have been published in journals like the New England Journal of Medicine on trying to prevent obesity and type 2 diabetes in lower socioeconomic middle schools, for example. So this has been a topic near and dear to my heart for really my whole research career. And then what really got me thinking about this was a couple of months ago, one of our administrators in our Clinical Translational Science Center here at UCI, who frankly didn't need to lose any weight, but wanted to lose weight, as you know, many people feel that they need to lose weight, told me that they were going to take one of these new drugs and got their physician to prescribe it as a subcutaneous injection. It wasn't hard. And so I asked this person, well, what was the experience like? And this is really what got me, because what they said was, I just had no appetite. And then I said, what about side effects? Not too many, a little bit of nausea, but basically not too bad. And I lost the weight that I needed to lose. And then I read up on these drugs a little bit more and, got into their anti-hedonic, and that means, anti-pleasure kind of effects.
Right.
And I asked this colleague of mine, well, what about things you like to do? Like, for example, I know this individual is a bit of a wine connoisseur. I said, what happened there? And they said, I didn't want to do that anymore. I got no pleasure from that. And then I got really concerned because I'm a pediatric lung specialist. I take care of children with lung disease and still have an active clinic. And I know what kids are going through, and I know what their sort of the toxic environment for many kids of social media around body composition. And being interested in physical activity and sports, I know that there are certain sports where weight is of great concern. And in boys, that's wrestling and bodybuilding, and in girls, it's sports like gymnastics and dance and cheerleading. And, you look at the history of that, and there is abuse. There tends to be abuse, unfortunately, among those kids when any new diet suppressant comes out. And then I also know that kids and adolescents who have frank eating disorders, like anorexia nervosa, for example, which, as you know, is a very serious and tough condition to try to treat. But those kids have a high proclivity of abusing any one of the, dietary suppressants that comes out. And what struck me about these new medications, was ironically how effective they were. Because when you think of the other, medications that have been FDA approved for children, so one is orlistat, for example, and that, unless you're a 12-year-old boy and you like to have flatulence, right? It's not a very kind of enthusiastically received medication. And the other medications that have been approved tend to have things like methamphetamine, and you don't want to give an overweight or an obese adolescent a drug that can elevate blood pressure when blood pressure may already be a problem. So here you've got this really remarkably effective group of drugs. And I'm not, don't get me wrong, there are kids and adolescents who have morbid obesity and have frank type 2 diabetes. And while we would love to be able to change the environment so that we could deal with this environmentally, there is a role for these medications, but they have to be guided carefully. And my concern was, given all of these other environmental considerations, the pressure on kids to look a certain way, the explosion of counterfeit medications that the kids can get hold of, and we all know this, the sort of the Hollywood buzz and the influencer buzz about these drugs is such that I was worried that while many kids may be helped, there is inevitably going to be abuse. And I'm thinking about it when I consider, for example, the energy needs of the child and an adolescent. Unlike an adult, there is still energy that's required for growth and development and bone development. And we know from past experience, for example, in the gymnast community, in the female gymnasts in particular, before there were more strict regulations, many of these kids were literally starving themselves in order to maintain a certain body image that they thought would be competitive. And then these kids went on to develop bone demineralization and fractures later in life and problems with bone and joints and growth retardation in general. In other words, it was sort of starvation occurring not in a food desert, but in a place where there really was plenty of food. So to me, the idea that you would have a widespread use of a medication that effectively is a satiety-inducing agent that has other effects that we don't know about during growth and development, I thought we should really be thinking about the possible unintended consequences of those drugs. And so we wrote this little perspective paper, which was published in the Journal of Clinical and Translational Science. And we made some recommendations about what we should do.
And you had quite an eclectic group of people input. I mean, you had some exercise physiologists, as I recall, and you had a lot of people.
Yeah, we were very, Carl, thank you. We were very, I didn't want to be the only one writing this paper. So we had the dean of our school of pharmacy, for example, to kind of consider, well, what are the cost implications of a drug which we know is now hard to get, right? Because so many people want it. We had representatives from our Department of Psychiatry to consider, the issues of adolescent behavior. And, post-pandemic, Carl, we're seeing an increase in depression and anxiety in general in the population, in particular among kids. We had a biomedical ethicist, a very renowned biomedical ethicist, to kind of weigh in on that. And I am an exercise scientist and physiologist and pediatrician. So we purposely kind of put our heads together to make sure that we covered the basis here. And again, we didn't want to, come across as that we're anti every medication that could help kids. Don't get us wrong. But we think we need to be aware of there's going to be unintended consequences and there's going to be abuse of these medications. And
so let's talk about this for a second. So these drugs completely shut down appetite.
Well, not completely, but they certainly induce satiety. Yeah.
Right. And like Mounjaro works not only on GLP, but GIP. Correct. So it has like a push-pull effect. It's even stronger when we talk about increasing the level of satiety on an empty stomach. And we know that evolution imprints us for what it thinks the environment is. So we have parents who are very, very overweight, and they feed their children a lot of food. They give birth to really huge babies. This is all a result of epigenetic effects of the environment and the choices being made by parents. Joel Green and I talked about this the other day, and I'm asking this question for your opinion. But if people are using these drugs and they are actually causing eating behaviors that would tell the body that we're in a world of scarcity, potential famine, right? We may be able to control our urges to eat, but we are still starving ourselves in some, and maybe starving is too extreme of a word and people are going to take issue with that. But wouldn't that potentially have some epigenetic effects on childbearing adults who are using these drugs, that there's, during this lifespan, we had this one blip of famine. So what do we do with this offspring that we're being asked to build right now? Is that a far-fetched idea?
I don't think it's far-fetched, and it's one of the areas that we just don't know. And it's very, it's almost an oxymoron, because the drug causes your brain, through mechanisms that we don't completely understand, to think that you're full. But you, as you point out, physiologically, you may not be. And at a cellular level, you may not be getting sufficient caloric intake. And that's a brave new world, Carl. That kind of combination just doesn't happen. I mean, typically, and you pointed this out correctly, this is one of the points we make in trying to understand obesity in an environment where food is so plentiful, that we evolved as human beings into an ecological niche where food wasn't so plentiful. So the desire to eat made a lot of sense, right? Because if food was there, your brain is telling you, hey, dude, you should eat, because I can't guarantee you that you're going to bag that antelope, or that the hunters are, in the next few days. You just don't know. So it's always easier to get people to eat for that specific reason. So now that we're in an environment where food is quite available, we have the opposite problem. We have the problem of obesity, which is understandable, and we should never blame obese people. It's a biological thing, and we have to work hard to do it. But now we have a medication that can really do this, again, seemingly paradoxical thing. It can reduce intake and make you think that you're full when you may not be. And for me, as a pediatrician, and as someone interested in the energy balance question, energy expenditure, et cetera, at a time when kids are growing, when we know that physical activity is important, that having a healthy level of exercise during adolescence is going to impact health across the lifespan, to be thinking of and we should be considering. Now, in the studies, and there were two studies, both of which were published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and they were very good groups that did this in children, one with type 2 diabetes and one in obesity. They followed all the rules that are prescribed by the FDA and by the European drug equivalent of the FDA, that when you do a study like that, you have to add a lifestyle intervention, and they did. But when I looked at the guidelines that are used, they go back to 2006 and 2007. And they're not as stringent as I would like to see as someone who's done these kinds of studies. In other words, are we really measuring the amount of physical activity that the child did? Are we really able to measure their diet? And so interestingly, the addition of the lifestyle intervention did not seem to add much. And I contrasted this to the 2002 study in the New England Journal of Medicine from the Diabetes Prevention Program. David Nathan was the chief author on that from Harvard. And that study looked at the transition from pre-diabetes to frank diabetes in adults. And the idea was, could we use lifestyle? Could we use the drug metformin, which, as you know, is one of the mainstays for type 2 diabetes? And what they found was that in that study, in fact, lifestyle was better than metformin alone. And I wondered why the lifestyle, which I know can work in kids, and the reason it doesn't, why it wasn't effective. And what I came up with was that, by the time an adolescent is morbidly obese or has frank type 2 diabetes, there's been years of an environment where there weren't adequate places to play, where diet was, as you pointed out, you had easy access to low cost, high calorie, fast foods. And that became the mainstay of that child's diet. And it would be hard to think that by the time the child was enrolled in a clinical trial or sought medical help, that you could in 10 weeks or even 6 months undo this sort of toxic environment. And that's a problem we have to face as a society.
Well, and I remember doing a show probably 7 or 8 years ago with a scientist who did some research on the fact that doctors don't discuss often enough lifestyle changes with their obese patients. And we really dug into this. I listened to him. Keep in mind, I started doing this show after I saved my own life. I was 330 pounds. I had a heart problem. I was all messed up. And I became in love with physical culture, lifting weights, and I started eating differently. I paid attention to my sleep, but I did it all myself because I enjoyed the feeling of accomplishment in these new goals I had fallen in love with. And so I said to him, and the reason I'm couching everything in this is, I said to him, how often do you think these physicians don't want to talk to their overweight patients and give them any suggestions because these physicians themselves are overweight? Like, how am I going to tell you need to lose weight when I'm actually fatter than you? That's, not some. And he said, well, we've discussed that. We don't have any hard numbers on that, but we realize that's a reality. And I said during that show, and how many of these parents are raising fat children because they're fat themselves, and they can't have that discussion with their kids? It's almost like a vampire effect. I'm bitten, so that therefore I bite. It's like once somebody falls into that position, we don't want to offend anybody. We don't want to make anybody feel bad. It's become like the 6,000 pound pink gorilla in the room that nobody wants to discuss. It's like if you talk about obesity, like I want to say, I'm willing to bet right now that most obese children have obese parents, but that would piss somebody off in this day and age.
Carl, I think I've come to, I deal with, in my clinic, predominantly lower socioeconomic families and parents. They're wonderful parents. They want to do the best. I'll just give you an example of some of the environmental things that we have to overcome and why this is such a tough problem. So I live in Irvine, California. It's in Southern California, Orange County. Neighboring community is Santa Ana. Santa Ana is a predominantly Hispanic, lower socioeconomic community. It has a border with Irvine, which is middle and upper middle class. And the contrast between these two neighboring communities couldn't be more stark. Irvine has one of the highest ratios of park per population of any city in the United States. Santa Ana has one of the lowest. And so when we look at evidence of physical activity, for example, and we've had until recently school-based physical fitness testing, and you can compare these two communities, it's like night and day, Carl. I mean, you look at the kids in Irvine at the school-based physical fitness testing, they're up in 70% meeting standards. The kids in Santa Ana are 30%. And you look over the past 10 years, and this is all publicly available data.
And I would argue that safety is, look, I grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, just when Bed-Stuy went bad.
Yeah.
And I was a fat 12-year-old because my mother and father didn't want me playing out on the streets because kids were being kidnapped and shot. And so I would say parks, we can get by without enough parks if kids felt safe to play on their own streets.
Absolutely. And what you have in these neighborhoods often is that the landlords don't want the kids playing even on the little available front yards that are there.
Right.
We see this all the time, and there are many wonderful people in Santa Ana, and the schools are doing as much as they possibly can. And we worked with the schools during the pandemic. And by the way, Carl, I'm sure you're aware, one of the results of the pandemic and the shutdowns has been an increase in pediatric obesity, particularly in lower socioeconomic kids, and a decrease in physical fitness because of this. And so, maybe I'm jaded, but I look at the development of these new drugs and I applaud them. But all the money and resources that went into that, why is it so difficult to set up a basketball club in Santa Ana. I've talked to my friends. There's some years where they got enough money to do it, and then the funds dried up.
Right.
Why can't we open the schools after school? And your point about safety is very important. It's not even so much the quality of the facility as whether the parents think it's safe for their kids to be there. There was a number of years ago in Los Angeles, for example, there was a study that was done by RAND, and LA County put a whole bunch of money in refurbishing facilities and parks in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods. And they thought this would solve the problems of park use, but it didn't, because what happened was the new facilities were taken over by the gangs, and the parents didn't want their kids to go there. And the investment should have been in adult personnel who could ensure the safety of those venues. You see what I mean? Swimming pools, I mean, I'm so frustrated about this. But another point that you made about physicians. So lifestyle is one of those things that's hard to change. And giving a medication, quite frankly, is easier.
Yes.
And right now, with the pressures of most physicians, you've got 5 or 10 minutes with your patient to do motivational discussions, which can work. You need more time than that, and you need people who can be in constant contact with the community and with the child and with the parent. And we just haven't developed yet, evolved, I would say, to the point where we recognize that investment in educating physicians better. I can tell you that pediatricians, for example, even though I'm a pediatrician and physical activity is critical to us, we always ask a mom, is your child active, right? We ask them that, and yet I can tell you that in pediatric training and in medical school, you don't get maybe a single lecture on what do we mean by that? What is a healthy level of physical activity?
Right.
How do we measure it? How do we even approach it? And so we then are faced with a morbidly obese child who we know will have health problems, and now comes along a drug that doesn't have the terrible side effects, at least so far. Good point, that we don't know yet. And, we may have to have that child on that medication for the rest of his or her life. And the GLP-1s are remarkably effective, but they have so many different effects because the receptors are everywhere. They're in the brain, they're in the gut, I don't know what the long-term effects are going to be. And I know,
and shame, there are doctors out there right now. First of all, when metformin first came along, a lot of people were saying that healthy people should take them for anti-aging. And I said, no, if you're metabolically broken, take it. But there's lots of better ways to improve the quality of longevity than a drug like that. And you know what the funny thing is? I stood staunch in that position, and I got ridiculed by a lot of gurus on the internet, but now they've all come back around. Even Dr. Peter Attia, who used to applaud metformin, has said, healthy people won't benefit from metformin. If they do the things that are required, time-restricted feeding and things like that, that works better. So I started saying these GLP agonists are going to go the way of the HCG diet. Remember the HCG diet, 600 calories a day? Yeah. HCG was supposed to ward off hunger. People lost so much muscle that when they stopped doing the HCG, their basal metabolic rate had dropped so far that even when they starved themselves, they were putting back on weight. We're seeing that now with GLP. The real concern for me in young children is these drugs, they change the methylation, and methylation drives genetic changes. What if these kids have to stay on these drugs lifelong? And some people say, well, it's better than having diabetes. Is it? We don't know. People are saying that right now. What if you have to stay on it for the rest of your life? Do we really want to do that to children?
Yeah, I think these are really the kinds of questions that have to be asked. And again, there's no question that once a child has developed type 2 diabetes or is morbidly obese, we do need to try to deal with that. And whatever the environmental and lifestyle, interventions, they probably failed at that point. You know what I mean? So I don't want to be someone that says, I'm totally a therapeutic nihilist. I'm not. I just look at it a little bit differently. Like, if God forbid a child develops acute lymphocytic leukemia, right, which is the most common childhood leukemia,
Mhm.
you have to treat that child with medicine
Mm-hmm.
because they're going to die. There's never been a remission, a spontaneous remission, you know, so you have no choice. There's no question about it. But with obesity and type 2 diabetes, there is a wide range of, you know, lifestyle changes that can be done that, you know, we just have not sufficiently addressed them. I mean, I've worked with the schools a lot. PE has always been, physical education classes have always been an important part of schools, but the quality of PE is so variable, Carl. You know, I wish that we could put more effort into high quality PE. You know, not the kind of PE where the instructor sits there with 40 kids in front of a basketball hoop and has each kid wait in line and then take one shot. I've worked with wonderful PE teachers that can get kids to do activity that's fun, that's enjoyable. You know, it's what we call exercise literacy. You know, teaching kids about finding the activities that they like, that they have fun with, you know, doing them in group activities. And we know there's so many wonderful things from teams and things like that. But, you know, this competition even among the teams where you have kids, for example, that want to play volleyball in high school. They want to play, but then the coaches say, well, you're not good enough. Well, but why? You have a kid that wants to play. You know, I would do everything I possibly could to find a way for the kid to do it. And you know, this is why, you know, we were so concerned about these medications. As you point out, they have many side effects. They're very powerful. There's studies, for example, in rat models where they've addicted rats to fentanyl, to narcotics. And these drugs are effective in reducing their, you know, because they're anti-hedonic.
Right.
That could be a good thing for people who are addicted. But I don't know what the long-term effect of anti-hedonics are in kids. Will it lead to suicidal ideation and depression? You know, there's some question about that now. You know, thank God we haven't seen a lot of that, but it hasn't been used in kids a lot.
Just something more subtle, like just disinhibition or inhibition to do anything, like whatever it is, you know, have no drive whatsoever.
Yeah.
A lot of drugs do that now to kids, psychiatric drugs, where they don't get excited anymore, they don't get happy anymore, they don't get sad anymore. They're just, you know,
So we don't know. We just don't know, and we don't know what the long-term effects are. And you're right to say that, you know, the kids are going to be on them for a relatively long time, no matter what. It's not going to be a week. It's going to be months and months and months, if not years, right? So what are the long-term effects? Are there longer-term epigenetic effects? I think your point about, you know, a pregnant mom has a human being who is going through the most rapid growth phase of any human being, which is in utero. You know, the developing fetus has a very rapid growth phase. What is the effect of these drugs, as you point out, on the babies, the growing babies, sort of evaluation of what kind of environment am I coming into right now? And we have this concept of, you know, pediatric origins of adult disease and critical periods of growth and development. And there is a lot of evidence that the kind of nutritional environment in utero can lead to, ironically, type 2 diabetes or obesity. If, you know, the child perhaps was born prematurely and, you know, didn't have sufficient nutrition. So you, through epigenetic mechanisms, may in fact become more prone to be obese because your brain grew up at a time when there was not enough calories around.
Mom was starving 6 months ago for 3 months, man. We make a baby that's really has what would we call it, the thrifty gene turned on, you know what I mean?
Thrifty gene, yeah. And again, I'm sure that these drugs are not recommended for pregnant women, but
if you a lot of women don't even, you know, back in the day, I'm sure my mother was still drinking alcohol before she realized she was pregnant with me.
Yeah.
You know, she smoked cigarettes when she was pregnant with that. So women don't know, oh, you know, I didn't realize I was using Mounjaro for 3 months and somewhere along there I got pregnant. That germline, that you know, that imprinting has already taken place. It's preparing for the world that this baby's going to come into.
Yeah, and of course, unfortunately, you know, even some pregnant women are not cognizant or not worried enough about what, and they may think that this drug is safe, and take it because they're worried about excessive weight loss, which happens. There's a lot of we don't knows. And it's ironically because the drugs, at least at this stage, seem to be so effective, and don't have the at least initially, and you've mentioned some of the GI problems which are emerging, don't seem to have the terrible side effects that, the methamphetamine type dietary suppressants seem to have,
Right. Yeah, and people are willing to do just about anything to lose weight in this culture today. The funny thing is, I had Dr. Daniel Lieberman on the show a couple of times over the years, and the first time I had him on was after he had authored the book, The Story of the Human Body. And I think every physician should have to read that book because it details why we are the way we are, why we develop the diseases that we develop when we look at evolution and what it has built us for. And part of the problem, and I look, I want to tell people, I used to be 330 pounds. I had diabetes. I had heart problems, and I just sucked it up and I muscled through it and I made the decisions and I stuck with it. And here I am today because that makes me sound so great. But the reality is a fraction of people are able to do that. And that's because when we talk about evolution, we have to be honest. We are designed to consume energy and conserve energy at the same time. And Lieberman made a great statement. He said, if we find a hunter-gatherer civilization that's intact, and we put an escalator in front of that coconut tree, they'll stop climbing that coconut tree and they'll take the escalator up and down, because we are hardwired to find food, eat food, and then rest, because our normal operating system was starvation, and we're mismatched for
right. And there, I make this point a lot because I'm an exercise scientist, and you make a great point. The bulk of energy that we use is really to maintain what we call cellular homeostasis. And it requires a lot of energy to keep sodium outside of the cell and potassium inside of the cell. That's the bulk of the oxygen that we use in the ATP, energy formation.
Interesting.
And exercise, when you look at it, is, it varies from like 5% to 10 or 15% of total energy expenditure. Now, it can have a profound effect. That extra hour per day of exercise can make the difference between many diseases and not having them. But when you look at that exercise, and it's related to what you just said, Carl, in terms of overall energy expenditure, it's relatively small. So, as we said at the beginning, I always tell people it's easier to convince people to eat than it is to exercise. And the other thing about exercise is, remember that exercise itself is the most profound perturbation to cellular homeostasis that a healthy person could do. For example, when you exercise, you can increase your oxygen uptake up to 8 or 9 or 10-fold over resting values. You can't sustain that for a long time, but you can do that. The hydrogen ion concentration, the pH of your body, the body struggles to keep that at 7.4 because that's where cells work well. Carl, when you exercise hard, I can get your pH to 6.9, which is a profound acidosis. I always tell my medical students and residents that if a patient came into the emergency room with a pH of 6.9, you'd put them in the ICU immediately. But you can do that as a healthy person with brisk, heavy exercise. What I'm trying to make is that we need to be able to exercise. It's critical for the evolutionary niche to which we survive. But we, as you pointed out, we avoid it because it is a profound disruptor of cellular homeostasis, which is why we want to teach kids to do activities that are fun, that they enjoy. And on the other hand, it's critical. I mean, have you been at an airport recently? I always do this exercise and I watch families, and you'll see mom and dad and the kids, and you see mom and dad walking, and the little kids they're bouncing all over the place. They're looking here and they're running here, and why? Not because they're kids, because their brains are exploring the environment.
Mhm.
Their brains are learning. And you learn by exercise, you learn by moving here, you learn by running. So it's important to encourage kids to enjoy that part of their activity because they don't have to anymore. Listen, I don't have to worry in LA that some saber-toothed tiger is chasing after me and figure out. I don't have to run after the antelope, to bag that for food. We don't have to do that anymore. And so we have to substitute the need for exercise with the desire for physical activity. And that's the trick we haven't mastered that yet in many segments of our society. And then it relates to our concern about these new drugs is what if kids actually and adolescents start taking these drugs and they reduce energy expenditure during growth, during when they need energy and they need calories to grow, to continue to put new bone formation to build their muscles. What are the long-term consequences going to be? Now we know, as we said at the beginning of our conversation, that in those instances where it was done willfully, like in gymnasts or in other sports, unfortunately, that there were terrible long-term consequences.
Right.
And we know that starvation, in those societies where unfortunately there are food deserts or where there's not sufficient food, it leads to long-term consequences on growth and development, on mental health, on your ability to learn. And we have to face the fact that the physical activity is not so natural anymore, and we have to figure out how to position it to avoid obesity and avoid, cardiometabolic unfitness.
Sometimes I think the goal has to be something other than what my body looks like. And this has been my personal experience. So I gravitated towards weightlifting and then powerlifting. And I always accepted the body that the work gave me because my goals were to lift more and more weight in different lifts. And so I was able to have small goals and achieve them week by week, add a quarter of a pound, add a rep, so on and so forth. And my body changed, but I wasn't watching my body. I wasn't waiting for my body to change. In fact, I wanted to get bigger, but I wanted to get more muscular. Yeah. And I think the problem today is because of social media and what we see. We're so focused on what we look like that has become kind of the beacon that people follow. And I think that's part of the problem. I really think that we need to shift. If people, we've done shows. The first show I did was from the California Veterans Administration. It was in 2006. They had done a study that they started, regardless of why a guy came in, they made him do a leg press, and then they followed them for 10 or 20 years, I forget. And what they noted was the men who came in that did the leg press and were strong and remained strong throughout the period of the study were still alive at the end of the study. The men who came in and were the weakest and continued to get weaker, they died during the study. And, it harkens back to that old trope, the strong live long, only the strong, the strong survive. And if people would start focusing on getting stronger, they would have small goals that they could achieve and feel good about week in and week out, and then let the work form the body.
This is you really hit an important issue here in the schools. For example, in 16 states in the United States, there is mandated school-based physical fitness testing. Covers about 60% of American school children. Part of it is measuring height and weight in schools. And this, among parents, and I get it, can cause a lot of consternation because kids are bullies sometimes.
Yes.
And it does focus on something that I agree with you. We don't want to focus on obesity. We don't want to focus on overweight. We want to focus the messages about health. The messages about health. We don't want to stigmatize children. Look, some kids are going to have a higher percentage of body fat than other kids, right? But we want all kids to be physically fit. And I can assure you that except in very, very rare instances, a kid who's physically fit is not going to be obese. It's virtually impossible.
Right.
They may not look like a supermodel, But that's not the image that we want kids to look at. So, and we work a lot with the schools, and I'm working with teachers all the time, and we're trying, in the state of California, for example, as a result, after the pandemic, they're hardly doing the school-based fitness testing anymore. They're not doing height and weight. They're doing the tests, like what's a mile run or something like that, but they're not even recording the data, Coral. So instead of moving forward after the pandemic and focusing on health and trying through this lens to keep kids healthy, rather than obesity and overweight, we're moving backwards as a society.
Yeah, at a very critical time where we just took a bite out of kids' health, and instead of going, we got to double down and fix that, we're going, let's just stay down here. Let's just keep doing things.
And then and then the other thing, we should bring this out, and that is, as we said, that the counterfeit drug market through the dark internet is very dangerous. And I think as these medications get more and more into oral forms, I think the shots will scare a lot of kids away. They don't want that. Adults actually don't mind so much. But if these become in the oral form, which they will, and there are a few oral forms now, they're going to be available as counterfeit drugs. And here's my worry. I can't prove it, but my worry is that so many of these counterfeit drugs get laced with fentanyl. And the reason they get laced with fentanyl is because you get a buzz after you take the fentanyl, you feel good. So the adolescent thinks, I actually took a medication because it's changed my mood. I can feel its effect. It must be working.
That's why caffeine is such a popular additive to supplements, because you're like, it must be working. I can feel it.
Must be working. Yeah. And then there's the issue of the cost of these drugs, and they are so sought after. They're going to be very expensive. So what about a kid in a lower socioeconomic neighborhood who really could use these drugs? That child has already developed type 2 diabetes, and you want to get them away from that. There is an appropriate use. Are we sure that particular kid with not great insurance, that they're going to be able to afford to take this medication? In other words, when it is appropriate to use, will it be available?
And then that kid will turn to the black market.
Exactly, and won't know what they're getting. You know what I mean? So those were the reasons that we put this perspective paper in, and we really wanted to sort of alert the community and say, one, we really need more fundamental studies during critical periods of growth and development before we start, pushing these drugs. We should be aware of what are the effects on muscle growth and development in a growing child. Now, you can do some of those studies in rodent models, yes, you can. Adolescence in a rat is not the same as adolescence in a human. Right. In a rat, it's such a short time period that it's you brought up the epigenetic effects, and epigenetic effects are classically stimulated by the environment. Well, if you're a rat, the environment is a week, but if you're a human child, it's years.
Right.
It's years, and you can get methylation and microRNA development and acylation and all these things that can contribute to long-term effects, these epigenetic effects. You have a much longer time period in which a toxic environment can work, unfortunately.
Right.
But we can study this, and it should be studied. I also think one of the recommendations is we should educate parents, kids, and coaches to keep their eye out for the abuse of these drugs. If the kids are using them, or to talk to the kids, the coaches in particular, who are who deal with kids in wrestling. Wrestling, I was wrestling, wrestling, you try to make your weight, you know what I mean? And they do all kinds of crazy stuff to get to your weight. The ballet dancers, the girls going out for cheerleading, and the boys going out for cheerleading,
And gymnasts.
And the desire to compete and to be at the top of your level. And sometimes it's stimulated unnecessarily by parents, Carl. I've seen this over and over again.
Yeah.
May lead to, kind of crazy stuff. The coaches, the teachers, the parents, we need to reach to talk to them about these drugs as well. So these were some of the things that we recommended that the community start thinking about now before we see disasters. And hopefully we won't, but I think this is one of those instances where we really have to be clear-headed about this and not all the hype. There was about 2 weeks ago, there was a large article about this in the New York Times. And it went through the history of the development of these drugs. And I think the title of the article is "We Don't Know Why They Work," which of course got me a little nervous.
Right.
And one of the people that they spoke was a very noted obesity researcher who said, well, I won't have to just tell my patients to go and exercise. And I understand that. That's very hard to do. You experienced this, Carl. You were fortunate that you were able to, kind of really turn your life around. A lot of people can't do that, And so it's ironic that what that physician expressed was the frustration that we have in trying to get people into a healthy lifestyle. And we should study that more, and we should understand it more, and we should create, at least in the schools, environments where access to healthy levels of physical activity and diet are available and easy to get to.
Right.
Rather than jump to a drug right away. That's my concern. It's the over-medicalization of every one of these environmentally induced situations. That's my concern. And again, I am not against the appropriate use of these drugs. These drugs will probably help a lot of kids, but I am worried about the inevitable abuse and unintended.
Well, and the cavalier attitude about it.
Yes.
GLP-1 agonists, it's cavalier. Like everybody wants them. Everybody knows somebody who's using them.
Yeah.
It's why the manufacturers can't even keep it in stock.
Yeah.
Pharmacies, if you have a prescription for Ozempic, you could wait a week or two because they can't get it in. Yep. So it's scary. Everybody's on it, and we just don't. And I respect you, and I respect the physicians who are saying, look, this thing could be the greatest thing in the world, but there's a lot of unanswered questions. And as in medicine, we have to have the rigors of science on our side. We have to say unabashedly to our patients, this is safe. You can use it. And I don't think we can say that about these drugs right this second.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. And the example I used before was like, again, it's an extreme example, but if a child develops acute lymphocytic leukemia, you have no choice.
Right.
Zero choice. There's nothing you can do. That kid will die unless you treat that kid, or Hodgkin's disease, or one of the other. Right. You have to do it. And thank God we've developed through experimental and clinical trials. That you look at the numbers of acute lymphocytic leukemia. It's a miracle. 80-90% of these kids are cured. That's fantastic.
Right.
But with type 2 diabetes and obesity and overweight, there are things we can do before we go to the medication. That's my point,
Right.
And we should really make sure that we have done those things as well as we possibly can,
right,
before we start putting a growing child on a medication that has powerful and widespread effects, and we don't know what the long-term consequences are. That's my plea here. Mm-hmm. That's my message.
I'm with you on this one. I think it's great. First of all, I want to thank you for doing this interview on Zoom. I don't think I've ever done an interview on Zoom, but this worked out great, and this was an important topic, and I want to get it done. Also, to my sponsors, this is a commercial-free episode, so I'm asking those of you who are watching to go to superhumanradio.net and check Carl Recommends for all the great sponsors that make this show possible. Did we miss anything, Dr. Cooper?
No, I think thank you for bringing this attention to the world. I think we need thoughtful physicians, we need thoughtful parents, we need thoughtful kids, we need thoughtful teachers as we look at these, as we look at what's going to happen with these new drugs. And again, to reiterate, I'm not a therapeutic nihilist. I'm not anti-drug companies per se. I just think we have to raise these concerns earlier rather than later.
I agree. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Cooper.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks to the audience for watching the video, and we'll have more shows soon. Take care.